Emma had spent 10 years building a life as far from her family's money as possible. Then the will was read. Her grandfather, the man she had walked away from, had left her controlling interest in a billion-dollar construction empire. With one condition: she had to earn it first. Emma Gale did not expect the call. Not on a gray Chicago morning that already felt too heavy. Not while standing in a cramped community office that smelled faintly of cheap coffee and printer ink. She was halfway through reviewing grant applications when her phone vibrated across the desk, the sound sharp enough to cut through her concentration. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Almost. Emma Gale, she answered, her voice steady, professional, the same tone she used with donors and city officials. Ms. Gale, this is Harold Whitaker, attorney for the estate of Sirius Gale. Everything inside her stilled. For a second, she didn't respond. The name, Sirius Gale, landed like something physical, something with weight. 10 years. 10 years since she had last heard her grandfather's name spoken directly to her. I'm calling to inform you, the man continued, precise and emotionless, that Mr. Gale passed away 2 days ago. The reading of the will is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Your presence is required. Required. Emma let out a slow breath, pressing her fingers against the edge of the desk. I don't think that's necessary, she said carefully. We haven't had contact in a decade. I'm sure whatever arrangements were made don't involve me. A pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Ms. Gale, Whitaker said, his tone unchanged. Your attendance is not optional. If you fail to appear, the contingency instructions regarding the redistribution of assets will be triggered immediately, and the opportunity to secure the legacy your mother sacrificed for will be lost. Emma's jaw tightened. He knew exactly which wire to pull. She looked around the office. The mismatched chairs, the peeling paint near the windows, the stack of folders filled with people who needed help more than they needed excuses. Fine, she said, her voice cold. Time and location. He gave her an address in downtown Chicago, a building she recognized immediately, even if she hadn't seen it in years. Gale Tower. Of course. Be there at 9 sharp, Whitaker finished. There are conditions that require your direct acknowledgement. Conditions. Emma ended the call without another word. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she exhaled slowly, forcing her thoughts back into order. It shouldn't matter. Whatever Cyrus Gale had built, whatever he had destroyed along the way, it wasn't hers. Not anymore. She had made that choice 10 years ago. She turned back to her desk, picked up the top file, and tried to focus. It didn't work. The words blurred. Her mind dragged her backward, against her will. A house that never felt like a home. Cold marble floors. Conversations that sounded more like negotiations. And Cyrus Gale, always distant, always calculating, as if even family was just another asset to manage. Emma closed the file. No, that was over. She had built something different. Something real. The next morning arrived faster than she wanted. The city felt sharper, louder, as if it knew exactly where she was going. Gale Tower rose above everything else, a glass and steel monument that reflected the sky like it owned it. Emma stood at the base for a moment, her hands in the pockets of her coat. Nothing had changed. Or maybe everything had, and she was the only one who didn't belong here anymore. Inside, the lobby was exactly as she remembered, polished, silent, efficient. People moved with purpose, voices low, eyes focused. No wasted motion. No wasted time. A receptionist directed her upstairs without asking unnecessary questions. Of course they were expecting her. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. Each floor ticked upward like a countdown. By the time the doors opened, Emma's expression had settled into something neutral, controlled. The conference room was already occupied. A long table, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And people, lawyers, executives, board members, each one turning slightly as she entered. Measuring, assessing, judging. At the head of the table stood Harold Whitaker. Mid-60s, precise posture, eyes that missed nothing. Ms. Gale, he said, acknowledging her with a small nod. You're on time. You said it wasn't optional, Emma replied. No emotion, just fact. A flicker of something. Approval, maybe, crossed his face before disappearing. Please, take a seat. We'll begin shortly. Emma sat without another word. She could feel it. The weight of attention, the quiet curiosity. The estranged granddaughter. The one who left. The one who chose a different path. Let them look. It didn't change anything. Or at least, that's what she told herself. The door opened again. Another presence entered the room. Different energy, heavier, sharper. Emma didn't turn immediately, but she felt it. The shift. The kind that doesn't need introduction. When she finally looked, her gaze landed on him. Mark Russo. He didn't need to be introduced. Between her and that name, between her past and her present, was about to be decided in this room. And she had no intention of letting it decide her. Whitaker opened the document. We will proceed directly to the primary allocations. No build-up. No sentiment. Just business. Exactly how Cyrus Gale would have wanted it. Emma listened without reacting as assets were distributed, foundations named, obligations assigned. It all sounded distant, irrelevant. Until it wasn't. To my granddaughter, Emma Gale, Whitaker read, his voice cutting cleanly through the room. I leave 51% controlling interest in Gale Construction Holdings. A collective intake of breath swept through the table, followed by a heavy, stunned silence. For a moment, even the city outside seemed to go quiet. Silence. Not the quiet kind. The sharp kind. The kind that slices through every assumption in the room. Emma didn't move. For a second, she thought she had misheard. 51%. Controlling interest. No, that didn't make sense. That wasn't. Her gaze snapped to Whitaker. That's not possible. Her voice was calm. Too calm. We had no contact. There's no basis for. There are conditions, Whitaker interrupted smoothly. Of course there were. Emma's jaw tightened slightly. What conditions? Whitaker adjusted the document, his tone unchanged. Ownership is contingent upon a 1-year term of active executive involvement within the company. During this period, Ms. Gale will operate in direct partnership with the current chief executive officer. A pause. Deliberate. Then, Mr. Mark Russo. The name landed differently this time. Heavier. Emma turned her head slowly. Mark was already looking at her. No surprise now. Just something sharper. Controlled irritation. Maybe even anger. Good. The feeling was mutual. Whitaker continued, unaffected. Failure to meet these conditions will result in the automatic transfer of controlling interest to a designated secondary party. The room held its breath. This wasn't just a family handover. It was a hostile takeover from beyond the grave. Emma could already see the senior partners exchanging looks that promised a barrage of lawsuits challenging the will's sanity clauses before the week was out. Emma didn't ask who. She didn't need to. She could feel the answer sitting somewhere in the room, waiting. The air had changed. What had started as obligation had become something else entirely. A trap, a test, or both. Emma leaned back slightly in her chair, her mind already moving, already recalculating. 1 year. 1 year inside a world she had walked away from. 1 year working alongside a man who clearly did not want her there. She should refuse. Walk away. Let the empire collapse into whatever came next. That would be the easy choice. The clean choice. But something about it didn't sit right. 51%. Cyrus Gale didn't do anything without purpose. This wasn't a mistake. It was a move. Emma's gaze shifted back to Mark. He hadn't looked away. Not this time. Fine. If this was a game, then it had just become mutual. When do we start? She asked. No hesitation. No doubt. Just decision. And for the first time since she walked into the room, something changed in Mark Russo's expression. Not acceptance. Not approval. But recognition. The kind that comes when the board is set, and both players realize the game is real. Mark Russo did not stand when the meeting ended. He stayed seated, fingers lightly touching the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the documents as if numbers were more predictable than people. Around him, the room shifted. Chairs moved, low voices resumed. Lawyers gathered their folders, but none of it mattered. What mattered had just changed the structure of everything he had built. 51%. Control. And her. Emma Gale rose from her seat without haste, every movement deliberate. She felt the attention again, sharper now, no longer curiosity but calculation. They were already adjusting to her presence, rebalancing loyalties, reconsidering positions. Power did that, even when it arrived uninvited. She didn't look at Mark immediately. She didn't need to. The tension between them was already defined. But she felt it, the expectation that she would approach, that she would say something, that she would acknowledge the situation in the way people always did in rooms like this. Politely, strategically, safely. She didn't know him that. Still, She walked toward him, not because it was expected, but because avoiding it would be a statement of its own. Mark finally looked up when she stopped across the table from him. Up close, he was exactly as she remembered from the articles. Sharp lines, controlled expression, the kind of presence that didn't ask for authority because it already had it. "You knew?" Emma asked. No greeting, no introduction, just the question that mattered. Mark's gaze didn't shift. No, a beat. If I had, this room would look very different. She believed him, not because of trust, but because of logic. A man like Mark Russo didn't let control slip without a fight. And this was a loss of control. "Then we're both working with new information," she said. His expression tightened slightly. "Don't mistake this for partnership." There it was. Direct. Honest. Exactly what she expected. Emma tilted her head just enough to meet his tone without mirroring his hostility. "I'm not mistaking anything. I'm acknowledging the condition." Mark stood then, slow, deliberate, closing the distance by a fraction without crossing it. "You don't belong here." Not raised. Not aggressive. Just certain. Emma didn't flinch. "That's not your decision anymore." A flicker in his eyes. Annoyance, controlled quickly. Good. She had hit the right point. "This company," he continued, "runs on experience, not ideals. You can't manage construction projects the way you manage charity boards." Emma's response came without delay. "And you can't manage people like they're numbers on a balance sheet." Silence. Not empty. Charged. For a second, neither moved. Then Mark exhaled through his nose, a quiet release of tension that didn't soften anything. "We start tomorrow," he said. Not a suggestion. 8 a.m. executive floor. Emma nodded once. "I'll be there." No argument. No hesitation. Another flicker, this time harder to read. Not approval. Not quite resistance either. Something closer to recalibration. Mark stepped past her, already moving on, already shifting focus to the next problem, the next decision. That was how he operated. Forward. Always forward. Emma watched him go for exactly 1 second before turning in the opposite direction. If this was going to work, or at least not collapse immediately, she needed information. Not opinions. Not assumptions. Facts. The rest of the day moved differently now. Every step through Gale Tower felt like entering territory that remembered her even if she didn't belong to it anymore. Offices behind glass walls. Conversations that stopped when she passed. Screens filled with numbers, projections, timelines. This was scale. This was power. And it was all connected to a name she had spent 10 years trying to leave behind. By the time she left the building, the city felt different again. Larger. Sharper. Like it was waiting to see what she would do next. The next morning, Emma arrived at 7:52 a.m. Not early enough to make a statement. Not late enough to lose one. The executive floor was quieter than the rest of the building, insulated from noise and distraction. Here, decisions were made before most people finished their first coffee. Mark was already there. Of course he was. Standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, reviewing something on a tablet, posture straight, attention absolute. He didn't look up when she approached. "You're 8 minutes early," he said. "You're 8 minutes late if you measure against my schedule." Emma stopped a few feet away, unbothered. "Good thing I'm not working for you." Now he looked at her. Direct. Measuring. That's exactly the problem. She held his gaze. "No. The problem is you think it is." Another pause. Shorter this time. Tighter. Mark set the tablet down on the table between them. "Let's establish something clearly," he said. "You may have controlling shares on paper, but this company functions because of structure. Process. People who know what they're doing." Emma didn't interrupt. Not because she agreed, but because she wanted to hear the full shape of his argument. "You disrupt that without understanding it," he continued. "You don't just fail. You take everything down with you." There it was again. Control, responsibility, pressure. He wasn't protecting his position. He was protecting the system. That mattered. Emma stepped closer to the table, her voice steady. "Then explain it." Mark's expression didn't change. "This isn't a classroom." "No," she said. "It's a company I now partially own, which means if I'm expected to operate inside it, I need full visibility." He studied her for a second longer than necessary. Not dismissing. Not accepting. Evaluating. "You'll get what you need," he said finally. "Not more." Emma nodded once. "That's enough. For now." He picked up the tablet again, tapped the screen, then turned it toward her. A construction site overview. Financials. Timelines. Risk assessments. Complex, layered, precise. Project Westline, he said. High-value development. Tight deadlines. Zero tolerance for error. Emma scanned the data quickly, her focus narrowing. Community impact? Mark didn't hesitate. Contained. She looked up. That's not an answer. It's the one that matters for execution. Emma shook her head slightly. Not if it creates resistance. A beat. Then another. Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Resistance is managed. Or avoided, she countered. Silence again. This time different. Not just conflict, friction with direction. Mark took the tablet back, his movements precise. We're not redesigning operational strategy on day one. Emma didn't push further. Not yet. She had made her point. That was enough for now. Then show me where it breaks, she said instead. That got his attention. Not fully, but enough. What? If the system is as solid as you say, she continued, you should know exactly where it fails under pressure. He watched her, the irritation from earlier shifting into something more focused. You're assuming failure. I'm assuming reality, she said. A long second passed. Then Mark turned away, gesturing toward the conference table. Sit. Not an order. Not quite a request. Something in between. Emma sat. What followed wasn't a lesson. It was a test. Mark moved through data, scenarios, decision trees, fast, precise, expecting her to keep up. And she did. Not perfectly. Not at his level. But enough to show that she wasn't guessing. Enough to show that she could think in structure, not just principle. The tension didn't disappear. It sharpened. Focus replaced assumption. By the time they paused, the air in the room had shifted again. Still cold. Still distant. But no longer dismissive. Mark leaned back slightly, studying her with a different lens. You're not completely unprepared, he said. Not praise. Just acknowledgement. Emma met his gaze without reacting. And you're not completely inflexible. Another flicker. Smaller this time. But real. Neither smiled. Neither softened. But something had changed. Not trust. Not yet. But the beginning of something that could become it. Or destroy it. And somewhere in the building, unnoticed for now, another player was already watching the board reset. The article went live at 9:12 a.m. It didn't appear on the front page immediately. It didn't need to. By 9:27, it was already circulating through internal chats, forwarded in quiet threads, opened behind half-closed office doors. By 9:41, Emma felt it without seeing it. Conversations shifted when she entered a room. Not stopped, redirected. Lowered just enough to signal awareness, not enough to be called out. She didn't ask. She walked straight to the nearest screen, pulled up the financial news feed, and found it in less than 3 seconds. Gale Construction's new heir, idealism over competence? The headline was clean, controlled, designed to look like analysis, not attack. Emma read the first paragraph, then the second. By the third, she stopped. It was precise. Too precise. References to her work in the nonprofit sector framed as inexperience. Mentions of her decade-long absence positioned as abandonment. Carefully selected quotes from anonymous sources inside the company questioning her capability. Not loud. Not emotional. Strategic. She closed the article. Not because she was done, but because she had seen enough. This wasn't random. This was placed. Behind her, a voice cut through the space. You read fast. Mark. Emma didn't turn immediately. It's efficient when the message is obvious. He stepped closer, stopping at a distance that suggested awareness without intrusion. And what's the message? Now she looked at him. That I'm not supposed to last a year. A beat. And that someone wants to make sure I don't. Mark's expression didn't shift, but his focus sharpened. Welcome to visibility. Emma held his gaze. You're not surprised? No, honest. As expected. Should I be? She tilted her head slightly. Depends. If this affects the company, it's your problem too. Everything that affects the company is my problem, he said. No hesitation. No defensiveness. Just fact. Emma nodded once. That aligned. Then we're aligned on at least one thing. Mark didn't respond to that. Instead, he reached past her, scrolling through the article on the screen. His eyes moved quickly, scanning structure, tone, implication. Not reading for content, reading for intent. This isn't random press, he said. It's seated. Emma crossed her arms lightly. I figured. They're testing response time, he added. And internal reaction. And he looked at her. You haven't reacted. Neither have you. A pause. Then, Almost imperceptibly, something shifted in his posture. Not agreement. Recognition. Good, he said. Emma didn't smile. So what's the play? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned away from the screen, already moving toward the conference room. We don't respond publicly, he said. Not yet. Emma followed without hesitation. That lets the narrative set. No, Mark replied. It lets the source reveal itself. She considered that for half a second. Then, you already have a suspect. He didn't look back. I have a short list. They entered the conference room. The door closed behind them with a soft, controlled click. Mark placed his tablet on the table, pulling up internal communication logs, media tracking, timelines. Everything moved fast now. Focused. Precise. Emma stepped closer, scanning the data. Anonymous sources, she said. Internal. Or positioned to look internal, Mark corrected. There's a difference. She nodded slightly. True. Timing, she asked. Too fast for organic pickup, he said. Which means it was prepared in advance. Emma's eyes narrowed just enough. Before the will was read. Mark glanced at her. Exactly. Silence settled for a moment. Not empty, tight. This wasn't reaction anymore. This was pattern recognition. Emma leaned her hands lightly against the table. Who benefits? Mark didn't hesitate. Anyone who needs you destabilized. She met his gaze. That's a wide field. Not inside this company. A beat. Then she said it. Arthur. The name didn't echo. It landed. Mark didn't confirm immediately. He didn't need to. He has motive, Emma continued. Loss of control. Public narrative. Pressure on the board. Mark watched her as she spoke, measuring not just the content, but the structure of her thinking. And access, he added. Emma's jaw tightened slightly. Family access. Which is the most efficient kind, Mark said. No emotion. Just accuracy. Emma exhaled slowly. Not frustration, containment. So he starts with perception, she said. Undermines credibility before I can establish it. Mark nodded once. And waits for you to make a mistake. Emma straightened. Then I don't. A brief silence. Then Mark said, that's not enough. She didn't react. Then what is? He stepped closer to the table, tapping the screen once. New data. Board member activity. Communication spikes. Patterns. We control internal alignment, he said. If the board fractures, perception becomes reality. Emma followed the data quickly. Who's unstable? Mark highlighted 2 names. Not disloyal, he said, but responsive to pressure. Emma memorized them. No hesitation. No comment. We speak to them directly, she said. Before the narrative settles. Mark looked at her. Not disagreement. Evaluation. Then, together. A small shift. But significant. Emma nodded once. Together. The word held. Not as agreement. As strategy. Mark closed the tablet. This isn't a one-time move, he said. If it's Arthur, he won't stop here. Emma's expression hardened slightly. Not emotionally, but structurally. Good. He raised an eyebrow. Good. Better to know the pattern early, she said, than pretend it's isolated. A beat. Then Mark said, you adapt fast. Emma met his gaze. I don't have a choice. Silence again. But different. Not conflict. Not yet trust. Something more precise. Alignment under pressure. Outside the room, the company continued to move. Meetings, calls, decisions. But inside, the structure had shifted again. Not visible. Not public. But real. Emma turned slightly toward the window, the city stretching out below. For a moment, she allowed herself to see it differently. Not as something distant. Not as something she had left behind. But as something she was now inside of. Fully. No distance. No separation. Behind her, Mark spoke again. We meet the board at noon. She didn't turn back immediately. Then let's make sure they're not reading headlines when we walk in. He watched her for a second. Then nodded. Agreed. And somewhere else in the city, Arthur Gale read the same article with a slow, satisfied smile. Already planning the next move. Already assuming the first had landed exactly as intended. He wasn't wrong. But he wasn't entirely right either. The board was set. The first move had been made. And for the first time, Emma Gale wasn't reacting. She was playing. The West Line site was a chaotic expanse of exposed rebar and deafening machinery, a stark contrast to the sterile halls of Gale Tower. Emma felt the familiar weight of the Gale legacy pressing against her, but instead of running, she channeled the same stubborn grit that had once driven her to build a life from scratch. If she was to be trapped in this world, she would master its mechanics until she could dismantle the parts that had broken her family. Emma didn't just approach the residence. She walked into the center of the friction, ignoring the mud ruined on her boots. She didn't offer vague compromises. She presented a revised logistics schedule she drafted at 4 a.m., showing exactly how shifting the crane operations would reduce noise for the neighboring school. Mark stood back, his arms crossed, his gaze transitioning from skepticism to a wary, silent calculation. He didn't offer a smirk or a soft observation. He simply noted that her data was indisputable, even if her presence was still a disruption to his established order. Every step, every word, every decision would now count, and she was ready to meet it all head-on, alongside Mark, aligned by circumstance, observation, and the sharp edge of necessity. The office was nearly empty, the city hubbub muted behind the thick glass walls of Gale Construction's downtown tower. Emma sat at her desk, reviewing spreadsheets, schedules, and internal reports, her focus unwavering. Mark leaned against the edge of the conference table, tablet in hand, scanning correspondence, tracking employee responses, internal memos, and board communications. Neither spoke immediately. The silence was precise, filled with concentration rather than tension. Finally, Mark broke it. "You handled the Westline site well," he said, not as praise, but as observation. Emma looked up briefly. "It was the right approach," she replied evenly. "Listening, acknowledging, offering compromise. I expected resistance, but I didn't anticipate the subtle shifts in power dynamics." Mark's gaze held hers for a fraction longer than necessary. "You think in patterns. You've noticed," she said without inflection. "And you've adapted," he added, not looking away. The words hung in the air. Not praise, not challenge, recognition. They had begun to measure each other quietly, through observation, through action, not words. Emma set down her pen and leaned back slightly, considering the space between them. "You've never shared much about yourself," she said, testing the boundary. Mark glanced at her, weighing the relevance. "I don't usually volunteer personal history." "Then this is unusual," she pressed gently, "because I want to understand the person I'm working with, not just the executive." His expression remained neutral, but his eyes flickered with something fleeting, guarded honesty. "I grew up with very little," he said finally. "Everything I have, I've earned. Every decision, every risk, every hour invested. It was mine to claim or lose." Emma absorbed this, letting the information settle without judgment. "And your relationship with my grandfather?" she asked carefully. "Sirius was a mentor," Mark said. "Not perfect, not always fair, but he believed in results. And I respected that." He paused, then added quietly, "I also trusted him. Trusted that his decisions were just." Emma's mind turned to her own family, to the reasons her mother had left, the long silence from her grandfather, the fractured bonds of the Gale legacy. "My mother didn't stay," she said softly, almost to herself. "She left because of what this family expects, of loyalty, obedience, appearances." Mark observed her, but did not interrupt. She continued, her voice steady. "I've spent my life outside this world, building something different, something meaningful. And now, I'm thrust back into it, expected to conform without understanding." Mark's posture relaxed fractionally, a silent acknowledgement of her honesty. "You're resilient," he said simply. "You adapt fast." Emma met his gaze. "Resilience isn't enough. I need clarity. I need to see the truth behind the intentions of those around me." He regarded her carefully, as though measuring the weight of that statement, the vulnerability it carried. "You will," he said finally. "But clarity often comes through challenge, not comfort." The air shifted subtly. Not romance. Not yet. But an opening, a mutual recognition that beneath the professional exterior, they were revealing fragments of themselves. Emma's hands rested lightly on the desk, steady, deliberate. "Then we face it together," she said. Mark's gaze lingered, the faintest nod acknowledging alignment without words. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent, but inside the tower, an invisible understanding had formed. They were partners not only in responsibility, but in uncovering hidden truths, in seeing each other not as threats, but as allies capable of navigating complexity together. For Emma, this was more than trust. It was insight, the first glimpse into the person beside her, the person she needed to understand to survive and thrive in the world she had inherited. And for Mark, it was a quiet revelation. Emma Gale was not a naive inheritor. She was calculated, observant, and, most dangerously, capable of matching him step for step in intellect and resolve. The foundation of their partnership was set, subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. From that moment, nothing would proceed in the company or between them without the awareness of this fragile, emerging bond, a bond built on understanding, respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement of vulnerability shared in precise measure. Arthur Gale sat in his penthouse office, high above the sprawling grid of Chicago streets, the late afternoon sun striking the polished hardwood floors and reflecting off the glass walls in golden slivers. From here, the city seemed orderly, precise, controllable, an illusion he clung to, because control was everything. The hum of traffic below was a faint reminder that the world moved without regard for plans. But inside this office, every variable was accounted for, every potential outcome measured. He swirled the scotch in his crystal glass, watching the amber liquid shift, catching light like a contained storm. His mind, however, was far from idle. Emma Gale had executed her first independent negotiation at the Westline site with surprising poise. Mark Russo, cautious but observant, had given her quiet acknowledgement. That quiet acknowledgement filled Arthur with quiet fury. In his mind, the company, the legacy of Sirius Gale, and the balance of power within the family were all being chipped away by this young woman he had long underestimated. Arthur's plan had been simple: isolate her, destabilize her trust in Mark, and regain control of the company's direction before she could assert influence. Now, her competence threatened to unravel his calculations. He set the glass down, its soft chime against the desk a small punctuation to his thoughts. Opening his laptop, he began orchestrating the next phase of his strategy with meticulous precision. Each keystroke, each carefully worded email, each internal memo was a move on a chessboard of human behavior. He drafted anonymous tips to journalists, framing Mark Russo's actions in ambiguous terms, implying impropriety without direct accusation, ensuring that every leak looked like chance discovery. Simultaneously, he sent internal communications to board members, hinting at concerns over Mark's influence on Emma, questions about fiduciary judgment, subtle nudges to create doubt. Every action was layered, overlapping, calibrated to create the perception of crisis without exposing his own hand. Arthur paused to review the drafts. A small smirk curved his lips as he envisioned the upcoming days. Emma receiving these accidental alerts, questioning the loyalty and integrity of the man she had just begun to trust. Mark, defensive and unaware of the full scope of the manipulations, growing tense under scrutiny. The board, caught between appearances and reality, vulnerable to suggestion. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, eyes narrowing as he visualized the reactions, the small cracks forming in the nascent partnership between Emma and Mark. Yet, even as he exulted in his precision, a flicker of doubt passed through his mind. Emma Gale was no ordinary heir. She was intelligent, adaptive, observant, capable of interpreting patterns, of reading intentions, of countering strategies with calculated responses. Could she see through the carefully constructed web he had woven? Could she anticipate his moves? He dismissed the thought. Doubt was a luxury that could not survive alongside ambition and control. Timing was everything. Tomorrow, the first volleys would be fired. Trust would be tested. Alliances would wobble. Emma would confront evidence he had placed with surgical intent. Mark would respond with instinct and pride, interpreting actions through his own perception of loyalty. And the board would watch, ready to be swayed by the drama and the evidence, uncertain of where truth ended and manipulation began. Arthur allowed himself a slow breath, steadying his mind, reaffirming control. He considered every angle, every potential response, and every contingency. The manipulation had to be flawless, layered, undeniable yet untraceable. And yet, beneath his confidence, he acknowledged, ever so subtly, that Emma's intelligence and adaptability introduced an element he could not fully predict. He would have to remain vigilant, ready to adjust, ready to escalate. Outside, the city pulsed with life, indifferent to the scheming taking place above. Lights began to flicker. On in neighboring towers as dusk approached, traffic shifted rhythmically. Pedestrians moved in patterns he could not command. Yet within this office, in the quiet hum of computers and the faint buzz of air circulation, the game was underway. Every message, every leak, every carefully orchestrated hint of impropriety was a step toward fracturing the alliance that threatened his dominance. Arthur Gale watched the city and the chessboard of influence he had created. He was ready. He would manipulate, he would provoke, and he would control. The first cracks were forming, deliberate, invisible to all but him. And by tomorrow, he intended for those cracks to spread, testing loyalties, eroding trust, and forcing both Emma and Mark into a confrontation of perception and truth, where only his careful orchestration would determine the outcome. Every word, every pause, every observation had been planned, executed, and timed. Arthur's empire, his legacy, his control, all depended on precision. And he would not fail. The office felt colder than usual, the late afternoon sun casting long, sharp shadows across the polished floors of Gale Construction's headquarters. Emma sat at her desk, the faint hum of computers and the distant traffic below creating a background rhythm that did little to ease the tension coiling in her chest. Her eyes scanned the documents spread across the table, financial reports, internal emails, and anonymous tips, each one a fragment of a larger, ominous puzzle. Mark Russo entered quietly, closing the glass door behind him, his expression unreadable, his posture tense but composed. "Emma," he said finally, his voice low, careful, measured. She looked up, eyes meeting his for the first time in hours, and saw something she hadn't expected, the slightest trace of uncertainty. "We need to talk," she said, keeping her voice even, controlled, though inside her mind, a storm of questions raged. Mark nodded, gesturing toward the conference table. They sat across from each other, the space between them charged with unspoken conflict. Emma pushed a stack of documents toward him. "These arrived this morning. Anonymous emails, press leaks, board inquiries. Someone is trying to undermine you, to make me doubt you." Mark's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the papers with rapid, precise movements, calculating, analyzing, weighing possibilities. "I suspected as much," he said finally. "But the timing is critical. Whoever orchestrated this is aiming for maximum disruption, trying to fracture trust before we can solidify strategy." Emma's mind raced. Each piece of evidence was crafted to look convincing, to provoke suspicion, to exploit vulnerabilities. And yet, something felt off. She studied Mark, watching his reactions to each document, noting the consistency in his demeanor, the absence of hesitation where deceit would have left traces. "I don't believe it," she said, leaning forward. "I've seen your work, your decisions, the way you handled the Westline crisis. None of this aligns with your actions." Mark's gaze held hers, unflinching, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the weight of the situation. "Emma," he said quietly, "you need to understand how this will feel from the outside. The board sees patterns, but not context. Press sees headlines, not nuance. And someone skilled, is manipulating both perception and reality." Emma's mind clicked into focus. She remembered Arthur Gale, the penthouse, the meticulous planning, the subtle manipulations, the precise orchestration. Every doubt, every suspicion, every shadow of uncertainty pointed in one direction. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from clarity. "It's him," she said, her voice firm. "Arthur. All of this. He's trying to make me doubt you, make me question everything, force a break in our partnership." Mark leaned back slightly, the tension in his posture easing just a fraction, though his eyes remained vigilant. "Exactly," he said, "and it's working on multiple fronts. Board members, press, even our own staff. The question is, how quickly you act will determine if the damage is temporary or permanent." Emma's thoughts raced. Every decision now mattered. Every response would be scrutinized, every action interpreted. She had to move carefully, deliberately, decisively. "We confront him," she said, voice steady, controlled. "We gather evidence, expose the manipulation, and protect both the company and our partnership." Mark nodded, respect flickering in his eyes, tempered with the weariness of battle. "Then we act strategically," he said. Together, they began to compile and cross-reference data, internal memos, financial statements, and personal communications, tracing the origin of the leaks and inconsistencies. Each piece of information, each subtle pattern, each carefully constructed email was analyzed with painstaking precision. Hours passed, the office quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of keyboards and the occasional low murmur as they debated interpretation and strategy. Emma's mind remained razor-sharp, focused entirely on the task, while Mark provided measured insight, his experience guiding their actions. She remembered a brief conversation from her first day, a young technician, Leo, who had been sidelined by Arthur for questioning a security update that felt more like a surveillance patch. Emma didn't call him to the office. She met him in the noisy, crowded cafeteria where the Gale name carried less weight. It wasn't a bribe that opened his door, but the realization that Emma was the only one looking for the truth, not just a scapegoat. By midnight, Leo hadn't cracked the server, but he'd found something better, a recurring ghost log. Arthur, in his arrogance, had been using the company's internal testing environment to route his encrypted leaks, thinking no one would monitor a sandbox server. It wasn't a master key Emma held, but a map of Arthur's footprints that he had neglected to wipe, believing himself the only architect who knew the building's digital blueprints. As night fell, the city lights flickered on, casting a glow across the glass walls, reflecting their concentrated expressions. They had uncovered the scope of Arthur's manipulation, the methodical placement of doubt, and the subtle exploitation of board members' perceptions. The final pieces fell into place, and the clarity of truth sharpened. Emma looked at Mark, and in that moment, there was no uncertainty, no suspicion, only shared determination. "We stop him," she said quietly. Together, Mark's eyes met hers, a faint nod confirming alignment, trust, and recognition of the fragile but unbreakable bond forged through trials, observation, and mutual respect. Outside, the city continued unaware, but inside the headquarters, the partnership of Emma Gale and Mark Russo had been tested, strained, and ultimately strengthened, ready to confront Arthur's manipulations head-on. The archival room was a sterile, climate-controlled vault of digital servers and backup drives, a far cry from the paper-heavy past of the Gale Empire. Emma didn't pull out a yellowed folder. She inserted a decrypted flash drive she had secured from a disgruntled IT whistleblower. On the screen, a series of hidden subdirectories revealed Arthur's digital footprint, a trail of encrypted payments to a third-party PR firm specialized in corporate character assassination. Mark watched the data stream by, his jaw tight, realizing that Arthur hadn't just played a game of perception. He had committed a breach of fiduciary duty that could be prosecuted. The partnership was no longer based on a shared legacy, but on the undeniable evidence of a crime. The board members sat in a silence that was less like a cathedral and more like a courtroom. Emma saw the faces of the directors, men and women who had known her father and grandfather for decades. They weren't looking at her with curiosity anymore. They were looking at her with the cold finality of a closing account. She could feel the momentum shifting toward Arthur, a heavy, invisible tide that threatened to wash away months of work in a single vote. If her evidence didn't land now, there would be no second chance. Emma didn't open a leather briefcase. She synced her tablet to the wall-mounted monitors, flashing the trail of offshore payments and encrypted metadata they had pulled from the servers. There was no room for Arthur's measured deflections when the digital fingerprints of his character assassination plot were mirrored on every screen. Arthur didn't panic. He adjusted his cufflink, a slow, predatory movement. "Screens can be faked, Emma. Metadata can be forged. You're playing with toys you don't understand," he said, his voice a smooth purr of condescension. He turned to the board, his smile widening as he prepared to deliver the final blow. But Emma didn't argue. She simply swiped her finger across the tablet, pulling up the second file, the one Leo had found an hour ago, a list of the board members' own private accounts that Arthur had been quietly monitoring via the same subserver. The smile on Arthur's face didn't fade. It froze, turning into a brittle mask as the temperature in the room plummeted. He had made it personal for every person at that table, and in an instant, he wasn't their ally. He was their predator. Mark presented a formal motion for Arthur's immediate removal, but the real blow came from the two swing vote board members Emma had contacted earlier. She hadn't appealed to their morals. She had shown them the projected financial fallout of Arthur's litigation risks, effectively making his removal the only way to protect their own dividends. Arthur's composure didn't just falter. It shattered as he realized that the secure server he used for the leaks had been compromised by the very IT whistleblower he'd tried to silence. The digital breadcrumbs were hidden behind layers of proxy servers, but Arthur's fatal flaw was his ego. He had used a proprietary encryption algorithm he'd helped develop years ago, a signature that, to anyone else, looked like standard code, but to a Gale, was as distinct as a fingerprint. He hadn't been careless. He had been arrogant, believing no one left in the building was smart enough to recognize his handiwork. It was his signature, a piece of code he'd written during the company's infancy, a backdoor he believed was invisible to anyone who hadn't shared his original vision. He hadn't just used the algorithm out of convenience. He had used it as a mark of ownership, a silent taunt to a room he thought he had already conquered. The vote wasn't a spiritual alignment. It was a clinical execution of a failed coup, leaving Emma and Mark standing not as heirs, but as the only ones capable of holding the wreckage together. The rooftop air was cold, stinging Emma's cheeks as she leaned against the railing, the vibration of the building's HVAC systems humming beneath her feet. Mark joined her, not with a gentle touch or a soft squeeze, but with a stiff, professional distance that finally began to thaw. He didn't offer a romantic reflection of the skyline. He handed her a tablet showing the morning's opening stock price for Gale Construction. It hadn't plummeted, it had stabilized. "You didn't just save your shares," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You forced the board to actually look at the numbers." Emma didn't respond with a poetic acknowledgement of their bond. She looked at the city, no longer a distant map of lights, but a grid of projects that now required her signature. They stood there in the dark, two architects of a structure that was finally, for the first time, built on something more solid than a name. As she looked out, Emma pulled a small, folded note from her pocket, the one Whitaker had handed her after the vote. It was in her grandfather's jagged script. "Emma, if you are reading this, you have already won. I didn't leave you the company because you were a Gale. I left it to you because you were the only one who knew how to live without it. Only someone who doesn't need power can be trusted to wield it. Don't just keep the keys, Emma. Change the locks." She didn't show it to Mark. Some legacies were meant to be shared, but some truths were meant to be kept as a foundation. She looked at Mark, who was already back on his phone, managing a crisis in London. He didn't see the note, and she didn't need him to. For the first time, Emma wasn't standing in her grandfather's shadow. She was standing on top of the empire he'd built, finally ready to change the locks.